Corvette was created by, or designed by a gentleman called Harley Earl, and it was in 1951 when he was noticing European sports cars starting to flood the market and come to North America, and he thought that Chevrolet should design its own sports car. So by 1953 they'd produced the first Corvette. It was certainly a car that had lots of style, and it was a convertible. It had no side windows in it. But the big thing that while it was a very sporty and stylish looking vehicle, it actually only had a 6-cylinder engine in it. So it was 150 horsepower. It was called a Blue Flame engine. So that car was produced for 2 years in 1953 and 54 with a 6-cylinder engine. But in 1955, there was a gentleman, Zora Duntov, came to work with General Motors, and he took a real passion to Corvette, and thought while the car looked very performance orientated, it really wasn't. I mean, the driveline out of those cars was pretty similar to the 50s automobiles. So he figured out a way to put a V8 in. So in 1955, that's when Corvette really came into its own and had a V8 engine. Ironically, in 1953, there was only 353 Corvettes produced. And we became a dealer in 1951 of General Motors products, and in 1953 we actually were sent a 53 Corvette, and we couldn't sell it, and it sat here, and it was here for I don't know how long, because I never got the complete story from anybody, and unfortunately anybody that knew the story is probably not alive anymore now. But from what I can piece together, we had the car for a period of time. We couldn't sell it for a year or two maybe, and then we sent it back to General Motors. And me being a car lover and a collector, I wish we'd never ever sent that car back, and maybe we still had it in inventory, because a great car to have today. So, from there the Corvette started to evolve, and for anybody who doesn't know, I mean, the current car is called a C8, and C stands for Corvette, and 8 means for the 8th generation of the car. So the first cars were C1s, and they were built up until 1962. Then they built C1s were built until 1962, from 53 to 62. Then they built C2s from 63 to 67. That is probably the car that has become the most iconic and most desired and valuable car out there, is a 63 Corvette split window. And the reason is because it was the only year built with a split window on the back. There was all kinds of controversy about building the car like that. And the first design of the car actually had a split windshield. But at this point, Zora was involved, and he was much into racing, and he said that it impeded the vision of driving the car, and particularly the back window also impeded the vision of driving the car. So I think they had a compromise, and they built the car without a split front windshield, but they had a split back windshield. And if you look at a 63 through 67 Corvette, you can see it runs sort of down the whole spine of the car. There's a line that runs down and goes right down through the middle of the split window. But because of the visibility issues, all the customers at the bottom really didn't like them in 63, and some people actually took the split window out of the cars. But it's become the most desirable and most collectible Corvette that's out there. And certainly one I'd love to own, but never have come across one yet. So from 63 to 67, they built that car. By the time they got into the late 60s, 65 and up, they started putting big blocks into the cars, and that's when horsepower really started coming into the scene, and they produced cars with 427 cubic inch engines that were producing in excess of 435 horsepower advertised. But those numbers are in many cases much higher than that. They were talking about the horsepower probably being over 500 horsepower in some of those cars. And the cars are not very big and not very heavy. They're fiberglass, and Corvette's always been a car built from fiberglass and molded plastics, and it still is today, so it's been part of its whole design heritage. From 68 to 82 became known as what was called a Coke bottle design car, and that car was probably the most purchased through the 70s and 80s because of its styling and the way the economy was at the time. But as the years rolled on, the horsepower, because of gas consumptions and emission rules, horsepower has actually decreased, and by the time you got into the early 80s, the cars were back to 150 horsepower again, but they were V8 engines. So Corvette went from being a performance car and with big engines to a performance car again, unfortunately with big engines with small horsepower. Then they changed them from C4, and that was kind of the evolution of more technology and independent suspension, more use of aluminum parts. and technology. Back in those days, the cars came out with an LCD digital dash in them, which was really beyond anything, because all the cars previous to that all had analog gauges and needles to read your speed and temperatures, but they produced these LCD screens. So it was kind of a revolutionary car. So those cars were built until 1996, from 84 to 96. But an interesting fact is, while the Corvette has been built since 53 to 2020, there was 1 year that a Corvette was not produced, and that was in 1983. So 82, they were going to produce a new body style, but they had delays in producing the car, and by the time they got around to producing the car, they actually skipped the 83 model year. So there is no existence of a car. There is one car that does exist, and it's in a museum down in Bowling Green in Kentucky, but there is no 83 Corvette. So 84 to 96 was that style. Then they moved into 97 to 2004, and horsepower started to come back, and the lightweight aluminum engines and things like that were produced in vehicles, and they continue to evolve. I think the biggest next step in performance and quality of the Corvette, because the 80s and the 90s cars were great cars in the early 2000s, they weren't amazing cars in technology and drivability and performance. But is when they produced the C7 through 2014 and 2019 is when the car really evolved and became a driving car, a performance car, and something that got certainly more credibility in the marketplace, from just being an iconic American sports car to something that was desirable and could prove on the track and produce performance metrics. So that's where it evolved. But way back since the 50s, Corvette had started something called the CERV, Corvette Engineering Research Vehicle. And I didn't get the year of it after, but it was in the 50s. They started producing a car with the engine behind the seats and called it a mid-engine. And it was a race car concept. And for years and years and years, even through in the 70s, when they produced a prototype of a mid-engine car, people have been talking about, when is Corvette going to produce a mid-engine car? Because if you want to be in the performance car business, and you want to have a car that can put horsepower to the wheels, there's a limitation on how much horsepower a front engine car can put to the ground and get the performance metrics. And so Corvette has been playing with this whole and teasing everybody for years, since the 70s, about producing a mid-engine car. And there was a point back in 2008 when that car probably was getting closer to fruition, but when General Motors declared bankruptcy, all that stuff got thrown out the window. And that's when they came back to the drawing board and started producing the the C7 car with the front engine. But there's always been a desire by the customer, desire by General Motors to produce a mid-engine. So here we are today, we get to 2020, and now we have one of the best performing cars on the market for dollar per performance. There's nothing out there that can beat it, and it's finally the mid-engine car. You know, it's had a long history. Corvette has been an icon of America, and let's call it North America, because it's equally as important in Canada as it was in the US, about being the iconic North American, Canadian sports car. And everybody's had a desire to have one or have had one, and you know, I've got lots of memories of Corvettes. My dad bought his first Corvette for the Hickman Motors collection back in 1979, and it was a 58 Corvette. When you look at all the years, you know, every year has been amazing and an advancement in the car, but it's never made the old cars undesirable as well, because the old cars have always had their uniqueness, and they become attainable to everybody. I mean, there's Corvettes, everybody can buy a Corvette, even though today's cars, you know, the MSRP starts at $70,000 and could be, depending on options, up to $117,000, $118,000. There's still lots of Corvettes that you can go out and buy. You can find one for $5,000 and start fixing it up yourself. So Corvettes, there have been so many of them that anybody can really get into the Corvette hobby and work your way up through the cars. And they've had lots of unique cars. I mean, there's lots of limited builds, and they produced only certain numbers of certain models, and they did it for racing reasons, or, you know, special options. And when you see some cars today, and being a car collector, you know, the value of cars, not every Corvette is worth the same. Some cars are worth much more. They could be identical, they could be all red with a black stripe, but depending on how many were built with a 427 engine or how many cars had air conditioning and these types of metrics, that's what makes those cars more desirable and more collectible. But you know, everybody who owns a Corvette loves them and has them and loves them for their own reason.